NATO defers making a decision about Ukraine's membership and saves the conflict for later. NATO will reach a compromise with Kyiv at its meeting this week. But the real test will be when the fire stops and NATO has to decide, is Ukraine inside or outside? Illness is just the beginning. Ukraine wants NATO to clarify the path to membership at this week's meeting in Lithuania. The request puts group members in a difficult position. Wait until they have to make a real decision. When the conflict finally stops, NATO allies will have to choose: will Ukraine join or leave? This is the time to truly test the League's unity. Kyiv wants to join NATO as soon as the war is over, and those who argue that the alliance simultaneously gives Ukraine a chance to join NATO. He argued that this agreement would help the current war and leave no room for Russia to think it could isolate Ukraine from the West. However, the allies are struggling to meet Kyiv's demands. While reconciliation is on the way, emotional lobbying and heated negotiations are only a small preview of the larger struggle between Europe and Ukraine when the conflict begins. Can conflicting countries participate? Is it possible to join NATO only after a peace agreement with Moscow has been concluded? What about friends who do not want to join Ukraine, especially for now? Then there is the case of Sweden, a controversial NATO member whose campaign has been stalled for over a year. The situation in Ukraine is more complex and requires more political action. Former NATO Deputy Secretary General Camille Grande said, "Basically everyone agrees that at some point Ukraine is now in the EU as a necessary destination to achieve. Everyone agrees that it will take some time, but what are the requirements to actually become a member?" Or as a senior Eastern European diplomat put it, if a decision is made in Ukraine immediately, it will be a great drama. What Ukraine can and cannot do now. Ukrainian leaders are trying to persuade NATO leaders to call now to avoid future political conflicts, even if real ownership happens later. The decision, said Ol Stefanishina, Vice President for European Integration. She said in the interview, as important as military support for Ukraine. But the controversial issue of access, which Ukrainian authorities hope will not succeed, there is currently a conflict. The United States and Germany in particular have shown strong hesitation in the thorny debate about NATO's future in Ukraine. To make. U.S. President Joe Biden has made it clear that he doesn't want to make it easy for Ukraine to join NATO. People are still worried about welcoming a country that has had Russian terrorists for almost a decade, and still has a lot of democratic reform to do. Washington also fears that a special invitation will cause the Kremlin, namely Vladimir Putin, to decide on difficult options that will prevent Kyiv from reconciling with the West. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz recently asked NATO leaders to take a thoughtful look at the problem Ukraine is facing, saying, "We in Vilnius focus on the importance of the hand, strengthen Ukraine's real fighting power." NATO experts noted that in the weeks before the meeting, both the USA and Germany sold their positions, and the agreement on this issue was controlled by the Eastern allies. A vague promise at the meeting that in 2008 Ukraine will become a member for some time. They want the final commit not to be made prematurely to avoid the situation where checking a box will lead to an automatic invite. In fact, in private, some Western officials have expressed concerns in the US that an invitation from Kyiv To join the defense relationship may force Putin to take more drastic measures. Others see the terms and conditions of Ukraine's NATO membership as an important part of the peace talks. Natalia Galabarenko, Ukraine's head of NATO, said that the most common argument is escalation, the statement she hears from time to time from her partners, adding that some friends in Ukraine thought the invitation closes everything for a while. Possibilities of meeting with Putin. The leader said he did not accept this idea, for the simple reason that Putin started to invade Ukraine with real fake excuses. Not true. For example, will Ukraine accept arbitration if Russia holds Crimea? If so, can it join NATO? This question involves the difficult task of deciding to enter Ukraine while the front lines are still changing. The representative added, there is no doubt that this debate will flare up or rekindle. But some friends are drawing a very sharp line. I can't imagine a real discussion about ownership of part of the country, so everything will depend on what happens after the violence ends. But for Ukraine's supporters in NATO, NATO plans have been put on hold because of them. The question is virtually left to Putin to decide when and how Ukraine will join NATO. Former NATO Deputy Secretary General Grand stated that Russia's veto power should be stopped and said, "There are interesting things ahead of us." For example, West Germany was united in 1955 when it was separated from East Germany. These are NATO's current debates, and members feel their needs are slowly gaining ground. Some friends see joining the group as a risk, but they change their minds, said the first senior representative of Eastern Europe. He added that the Allies do not want to send a signal to Putin that nothing will happen if the war continues. The US, UK, Germany and France are working on a so-called security guarantee for Ukraine, a bilateral agreement for continued assistance to Kyiv. The proposal is an indication of the long-term commitment ahead of the Ukrainian members, although it is unclear whether the deal differs from the current program. Gary Barenko, Ukraine's ambassador to NATO, said, "The good news is that areas of future stability have been reached, such as military aid, training, sanctions, financial aid, challenges and isolation outside the Russian Federation," said. However, Ukraine and some Eastern allies have also made it clear that they should not change the success of NATO members, even if stability is behind their interests. "This isn't a change," said Gary Barenko, "just a temporary arrangement until it passes Article 5, NATO's dubious statement of an attack that is the struggle of all struggles." Kyiv partners are confident but admit they have a long road ahead and months or years of negotiations. "Debates on how to do this are ongoing and will continue," said a senior diplomat from Northern Europe. "This cannot and will not wait until after the war. Ukraine will not be abandoned."